Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And if you can hear from Antonia's voice, she has been very under the weather the last few days, extremely ill. But we're podcast professionals, and we're going to get a podcast done this week and record it for you because we want to have it finished.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've been really sick. And the reason why I want to make sure that I make that abundantly clear is I'm not my usual self.
Yeah, well, your brain's going to be fuzzy.
Oh.
Your throat's fuzzy. Everything's fuzzy.
My sinuses have been filled with concrete. It's felt like I've had the looming specter of death above me, above my bed. And today's the first day that I feel mostly myself. So, like you said, we're podcast professionals, so we're going to make it happen. Most of the time, we pre-record for a couple weeks, but we ran out of them because we were traveling. And so this week we're like, well, we'll just record a podcast when we get home from traveling. And then boom, I got sick. So this is really our fault. This is my fault, really.
Well, and if you are into typology, we're both perceivers.
Yeah.
So we tend to do things free form, last minute sometimes. We're not always well planned into the future.
Yeah, exactly.
At least not to the degree we'd like to with the podcast, probably more.
Yeah, so what we're going to do is, since I don't know if I really have the ability to have like a super articulate, self-directed conversation, Joel is being very kind to me, kind of letting me off the hook by introducing to the listener something that we're going to set up from now on. We just finished, if you're a regular podcast listener, then you know that we've been releasing 16 different podcasts once a week on the Myers-Briggs types. They were about 10 minutes long. They were just short little quick podcasts. And we really liked having that second podcast come out every week. And we thought, that's about to run out. We thought it would be a good opportunity to release a podcast every week in its place, about 10 minutes long, that addressed a question from a listener, because we've been getting a ton of them. We've been getting a lot of emails from people and deep questions, like really thought-provoking, very deep questions that we thought could benefit a bigger audience than just the person asking the question.
Absolutely. I want to be clear that we're not going to stop doing our main podcast every week. Our long form, 45-minute to an hour podcast, that's still going to be coming out. You can still expect it to be the amazing podcast you've been listening to all along, and we'd still love to have you be a part of that. But we are going to have that short form. It's like a secondary supplemental podcast will come out also every week. Very short, 10 minutes or so. And what we are going to do today is we're going to seed out, basically show you what that will look like in more of a long format. We'll take a few questions here today and answer them, and then you'll see how that podcast will look. And this is going to give Antonia a break again because her body and brain are coming back online with us. So having this really great back and forth conversation between us might be difficult, but if they're pointed and directed questions, I think we can handle that today. Yeah. So we're going to do that today, and then we'll start back up, because if you've been following along, we've been doing a series on business and career and money making. We want to kick back into that next week. But this week, we're going to just take a quick break, illustrate how this question-answer format will work in the short form, and then we're going to go on to our regular podcast starting back up next week.
Right.
So let's get right into it. Our first question comes from Debbie, who emailed in, and she emailed a bunch of stuff, but basically the nugget of what she's asking is, here's the part of the question. Is there a difference between a shy introvert versus a sensitive introvert?
That is a really good question. It's hard to create a distinction between these two. Really, what I'm noticing is that we're getting a ton of questions about introversion, and introverts in particular.
They're on the rise.
Well, does it feel to you like there's an introvert movement going on right now?
Yeah.
I see a ton of articles and list articles and BuzzFeeds and Thought Catalog and, all these different, article aggregate sites that are about being an introvert. I think it's a big deal right now.
Yeah, I've noticed this too. I mean, I've seen articles written. There are actual entire websites. A new friend of ours, Jennifer Greneman, runs a website called Introvert Dear, and we've had some articles republished or repurposed there, and she's worked with us on some stuff. So there's a lot of cool stuff coming out about introverts. You're absolutely right. And the other thing that this question, is there a difference between a shy introvert versus a sensitive introvert? I would just say that it's assuming that they are one or the other, because I've met a lot of introverts that are not shy or sensitive. So that makes a huge assumptive. There's an assumption in the question itself that we need to make sure we address as well.
Yeah, I agree. The answer is yes. There is a major difference between the two. And I'd like to just take a moment to define introversion versus extroversion. Because of this movement of introversion, I think it's understandable why there's a movement going on right now. We've mentioned this in previous podcasts, that it was written in the early 80s in a book. Can't remember the title of the book. But it was written in a book in the early 80s that we are in the most over-communicated time period in history. So you fast forward, 25, 30 years, and we are in a massive over-communication crisis, I personally believe. Even as extroverts, like, sometimes I just don't want to look at my email. I just can't handle it. And I kind of avoid phone calls because I just can't handle how over-communicated we are. As an extrovert, I feel that way. So I can understand how introverts are at a point where they have to be so self-protective of their personal space and their time and energy management. I could see how it's becoming a thing, right? Like what do I do as an introvert in this over-communicated time period? So I understand the movement. And also, I think it's good to create some distinctions around introversion and extroversion, because I believe the word introvert might be co-opted, or it might be getting a little diffused or lost in translation. Most people who are introverts, or at least identify with the word introvert, see themselves as somebody who needs a lot of alone time. They're very protective of their alone time. And if they don't get it, they don't feel like a complete person. It's not so much that an introvert is, we think of introversion, extroversion as purely energy management, and there's a huge component in there. But I just wanted to define introversion really quick as, if you peel all the layers back, if you look underneath all of the obvious manifestations, all of the behaviorist components to it, like energy management, needing alone time, things of that effect. When you peel it all back, the actual difference between an introvert and an extrovert is that for an introvert, the inner world is the real world, and for an extrovert, the outer world is the real world. So when an extrovert is seeking stimulation, they go to the outer world to get it. That's the real world, so that's the world that's intriguing, interesting, provides energy for them, because if they spend too much time alone, that's not very interesting, because there's not that touch-in with reality happening. An introvert, on the other hand, because the inner world is the real world, every time they go out to the outer world or explore the outer world, they're getting feedback that will not gel with their inner world experience, right? Because there's never going to be anyone who experiences their inner world with perfect, mirroring precisions to the outer world. So every time an introvert explores the outer world and there's a piece of information that doesn't gel with them, right, is not resonating internally, they've got to figure that out. Why is the real world feedback that I'm getting not gelling with my inner world experience, the inner world experience, which is the real world? And so there's a reconciliation process that goes on, almost like an accounting ledger, right? This is what my inner world is saying. This is what the outer world is saying. Why aren't these matching up? And just like you can imagine with all accounting, all reconciliation, all math, basically, there's energy that goes into that. There's some thought that has to go into that. Well, if an introvert is in a space that is very different from their inner world experience, then a mass amount of reconciliation has to happen. And if an introvert is in a real world context that's very much matching their inner world, right? Like if there's not a lot of discrepancies there, they can spend a lot more time in that context. So when an introvert goes, well, I can spend a lot of time with my mate, right? Like my pair bond mate, but I really have a hard time in huge crowds. Well, it's because the pair bond mate is, to some extent, a part of their inner world experience. So they can spend a lot of time with that person because there's a lot of mirroring of what's going on in the inner world with them, versus a massive crowd where you're going to have a lot of different pieces of feedback that doesn't match their inner world experience. So that's where the energy management comes in. That's where you're leaking energy, basically, is in that reconciliation process. It happens totally unconsciously. Like, you're not really watching it. I mean, you're watching it happen because you're thinking about it, but you're not seeing the energies just sort of siphon out during that process, that reconciliation process. So it's important to know what an introvert and extrovert actually is, because when we attach words like sensitive or shy, these are different ways that introversion can go, but they're not intrinsic to introversion. An introvert could be somebody who has expanded their world wide enough, that has experienced so many different things, that they don't have a lot of reconciliation to do anymore. They've already done it in the past. So they're integrating all their outer world experiences inside of themselves so that they're actually not losing a lot of energy at all. That's when people get really confused about whether or not they're an introvert or an extrovert. They'll go, well, I'm mostly introverted, but I have a lot of extroversion in me. Well, it's not that they have a lot of extroversion in them. It's that they've expanded what the inner world experience is to them. So their reconciliation process isn't as intense.
Sure.
So, were you about to add on to that?
Keep going, because I think you had a thought you want to finish.
Yeah, well, the reason why I wanted to create some definition around that is there's a massive difference between a shy introvert and a sensitive introvert and an outgoing introvert and a not very sensitive introvert at all, right? Somebody who's pretty thick-skinned. There is a difference. There's a lot of different characteristics that can come with introversion, because introversion fundamentally is, I'm going to need some alone time to rest from reconciliation, from outer world feedback that doesn't gel with my inner world.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about the word shy and the meaning of what it means to be shy. And I was sitting here thinking, I don't know if shyness is a natural state of humans. I think it's a developed behavior. I don't know this to be true. I haven't really done a study of this. This just intuitively came to me as you were talking, that shyness seems to be a strategy for coping with something. It's a protective strategy. And so is sensitivity to some degree.
Yeah, well, I mean, all of our characteristics are strategies. You know, even introversion and extroversion are strategies to some extent.
Yeah, but particularly what I'm talking about is the idea of shyness and sensitivity seems to be, for an introverted person, a protective, like, it's a way to keep out this, external influences so that that reconciliation process that you're talking about can happen. It's almost like shyness, you know what it is? It's shyness gets up in front of it. So shyness prevents it from coming at you at all. And sensitivity responds when it happens to you, almost. I kind of see that as the difference, thinking about it out loud right now. And I'm not sure that bears out totally, but it's almost like shyness preemptively tries to keep it away, and then sensitivity is more reactive.
Yeah,
Shyness is more proactive.
I could see that. I think that's worth thinking about, maybe developing a little bit more. Shyness is definitely, I think, for sure, a strategy. But maybe we should define what sensitivity means to us. Like, because, I mean, I guess I'm assuming that when the person that asked the question is saying shy introvert versus a sensitive introvert, I have a definition of sensitive in my head. You might have a different definition of sensitive in your head. Yeah,
I'm talking about the people that are overly sensitive. They're easy to offend. Like, whenever you say something to them, maybe the wrong thing, they get offended to withdraw as a protective mechanism. And shyness would be a proactive end to that. So you shy away from getting into the social interaction in the first place, or you're the type of person that gets in the social interaction. It's not going the way you want it to go, and so you get offended or you get sensitive to the situation. You pull away in those moments.
Yes, I would say those are definitely both defensive strategies. The way that I read the question, and I could be wrong, because I always think of sensitivity now as sort of having that raw tooth nerve out where you're picking up a lot of stuff. So you're sensitive, like you have a sensitive instrument that picks up a lot of pieces of information. And because you pick up so much stuff, and because your instrument is so sensitive, then it can also be crushed easy. So I was thinking of sensitivity in that way. And actually, I don't know what the question, the original question, I'm not sure what their definition of sensitive was. So we can actually look at it both ways.
My guess, knowing that Debbie that wrote in is an INFJ, it probably was the former, now that I'm thinking about it. Or the latter, excuse me, the one you mentioned about the sensitive instrument versus being shy.
Right.
But that wouldn't bear out for all introverts. I mean, like, let's say an INTP, for example, won't have such a sensitive instrument they're leading with. They may have more of the other type of sensitivity we're talking about. It really depends on the person, obviously.
Yes, exactly. I was just about to say, there's going to be, as I mentioned, there's going to be some introverts that have done enough engagement with the outer world that they have encompassed a lot of the outer world and mapped it into their inner territory. So they're the ones who can spend more time engaged in the outer world with, different individuals and people, and not really feel the brunt of, needing to spend an egregious amount of alone time, because they've mapped a lot of the outer world into their inner world experience. I've known a lot of INFPs that come across as extroverts to some extent, or at least will believe they are, because they have an ability to not be so hypersensitive to other people's energy, but they have high awareness of other people's energy, and they figure out what's going on with other people by figuring out how it would feel inside of them. So they're sort of naturally mapping the outer world as they go, the outer world of other people. So that's not to say that there's not INFPs out there that are very, there's definitely INFPs that are very shy. I also think of ISFPs this way too. There's definitely ISFPs that are shy. And also there's ISFPs and INFPs that can almost appear to be extroverts because of how they map their inner space. So there are certain personality types that are introverts that don't come across as shy. Now, on the other side, there are certain personality types that are introverts, like you mentioned, INTPs, that aren't particularly sensitive at all in my definition of sensitive, as in they're not really checking in with other people's emotions very much. It has to be very, very, very obvious, when somebody's feeling something, like kind of a loud emotion, for them to register how another person is feeling. That doesn't mean that they can't be sensitive in the way that you described it, which is that they get offended easy. Although that's not very common for INTPs, it can happen. And so there's all these different variations, right? Like there's some introverts that are shy. There's some introverts that aren't. There are some introverts that are sensitive in both of our definitions, and some introverts that aren't. So there's definitely a distinction between the two. And I agree. I think you're really onto something. I think shyness and the way you define sensitivity, which is easily offended, I do think that those are strategies. And I think you really hit on something where shyness is a preemptive strike, right? Like, I'm just not going to expose myself to something that could offend my inner world. Versus sensitivity, which is, if I come across something that offends my inner world, I'm going to hijack the social situation and get offended, and now have the person have to come apologize to me or attend to me in my reaction. I think those definitely are two different styles of defense strategies for an introvert that maybe hasn't made peace with how much the outer world can be at odds with their inner world experience. I think you're really onto something there.
And I think if you're an introvert listening, the thing that is the antidote to this is to spend time getting your needs met as an introvert. Get that alone. I mean, this sounds obvious and something you probably crave, but it's something you need to do, is to set that time aside for yourself, getting your needs met, not being shy or overly sensitive in the way I'm defining it, but in fact being proactive and making sure that you are protecting yourself and giving yourself the space and the leeway for that.
Yeah. And I've also noticed that when somebody is using defense strategies like shyness, or if it's okay, I'm going to use the phrase oversensitivity to indicate that that they take offense easy. I've noticed that this is usually the response to trauma, that they have something inside of themselves that they haven't really attended to. And so, they're easily rubbed raw. It's very easy for them to get triggered. So if you're an introvert and these are defense strategies you find yourself using, it might be good to ask yourself if you've got some trauma that needs some healing done. Now, the form of sensitivity that I was talking about, which is having that really fine-tuned instrument, that's not the result of trauma necessarily. There's a couple different personality types that are very sensitive in the way that I'm describing it. Very very sensitive to things that are being thrown out there, other people's, sort of their psychic garbage, or even the positive things that other people throw out. And that's not based on trauma. That's just personality type. And that's actually a gift that they have. It's a gift that they need to learn how to use, which is why we try to provide some materials for these different types, like INTJs and INFJs. Sometimes INFPs fall into this category too, of being, highly sensitive in this way. And so we try to provide some tools for this. There are strategies to be able to deal with having high sensitivity and not having it overwhelm you. But that's not necessarily a sign of trauma. So I guess the fundamental answer to all of this is that there are different kinds of introverts. When you find out what your personality type is, if you discover that you're an introvert, remember that you don't necessarily have to follow all of the stereotypes about an introvert. That if you're overly shy or overly sensitive, that these might be a sign that you've got some trauma that needs some healing. There's nothing wrong with being shy. It's not a value statement or judgment. It's just that people who are shy oftentimes would prefer not to be so shy because when they're thrust into the outer world, it's very uncomfortable for them and they don't really feel prepared. So being able to go, shyness is not intrinsic to introversion. It's something that I can attend to. It's something I can work on or exercise, right? Being less shy, understanding that it's a defense strategy. And I might be able to get to a point where I no longer rely on it so heavily in order to shield myself from outer world feedback. Same thing with oversensitivity versus sensitivity, that there are certain personality types that are very sensitive to the outer, to the like little tiny things that the outer world is throwing at them. And that's not a sign of defensiveness, that's not necessarily trauma, that is just a part of your type. And then it's a matter of figuring out ways to not be overwhelmed by everything you're picking up.
Thanks, Debbie, for your question. We're going to head on to the next question. And this question comes from Frederick.
Frederick is somebody who has taken our owner's manual program, and his question is around some of the content that he heard in the owner's manual program. But since we've done a podcast on a lot of the information that's found in this question, we thought it would be handy for people who have heard these previous podcasts. His question has to do with the Graves model, which we did a podcast on a while back. And if you do a search for the Graves model on our website, you'll run into that podcast pretty quick. And we also recently did a podcast on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So his question has to do with effectively sort of combining these and understanding these two models, how they overlay. His question is, do you have something to show me to better understand the difference between Maslow and the Graves levels? I understand Maslow is more of a real-time check-in of my needs, but the confusion arises because I heard Wyatt saying that values are based on needs. So this means that in any given moment, my needs have different dimensions. And then he mentions his decision-making process. Once you know your Myers-Briggs personality type, then you know your learning process and your decision-making process, which is something that you can look up on our website too. We have a couple blog posts around decision-making processes. And then he says also his Graves level, and then his Maslow level. So he's basically trying to figure out, okay, what are my values if I've got all these different models telling me my values come from different places? And when he referenced Wyatt, this would be Wyatt Woodsmall, who has been a trainer of ours as well. We've learned a lot of information from Wyatt, and so he's probably learned a lot of information from Wyatt too on things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the Graves model. So to encapsulate his question, it's basically like, how do I manifest my model or my values? Like, where do my values come from? If I'm told that my values come from my Graves level, I'm told that values are based on need, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, says it's moment to moment. Do my values change moment to moment if they're based on needs? And then what about my values that come from my decision-making process or how I evaluate the world? Like, where are my values coming from if I've got all these different models sort of pulling me in these different directions?
Yeah, it's really a triangulation process. And one of the things we like to do here is blend a lot of these models together. It gives you that more accurate, just like a GPS locator. The more, satellites you're running off of, the more precise that locator can get. If you're only running off one satellite, sometimes you have a wider area you're in. So what he's actually asking here, how I'm interpreting his question is, can you help me triangulate my values better? Can you give me more of a precise location of what I actually value in my life. Because I've got all these models I just learned, and I feel like they're telling me to go in all these different directions maybe.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Where are my values emerging from? Or how should I understand how my values change? It's a really intriguing and interesting question. So to answer the first portion, what's the difference between the Graves model and Maslow? Or let's create some bigger distinctions between those two. Now, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a description of basic fundamental human needs that if we don't have met, our bodies, our minds, our psychology, our relationships will all register this. It's very easy to tell when you're getting a need going unmet because you will behave in an unhealthy way. You'll behave immaturely because you'll be seeking that need. So in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, just to recap that really quick, and I do recommend that you go look up the episode on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It starts with survival, basic safety and basic survival, physiological needs met, air, food, water, sex, right? Like all these things that are just basic fundamental components of human survival. And then when we get those needs met, then we graduate to safety and security, which is survival on a more sustained level. So it's not just my daily survival, it's actually long-term strategy survival. Like I have a roof over my head, I know I have food in the refrigerator at this point. And then when we get those needs met, we graduate up to love and belongingness, which are basically my social needs. Do I have a pair bond partner? Do I have people who love me? Do I feel like I belong in society? And then once we get that need met, we then turn our focus to our self-esteem needs, which is now that I've got my basic needs met, how can I make an impact in the world? Or even how can I just create a goal and reach and attain that goal? And once our self-esteem needs are met, then we enter a place called self-actualization. And self-actualization is when we really want to make an impact. We want to contribute to the world. We want to become better versions of ourselves. And that's why you'll see people stratified. You'll see one person who just can't get along with their mate. They're fighting all the time. They can't get their bills paid and they're a stress case. And then you look over at their neighbor who has their bills paid, who has a great family life and is trying to make a big impact in the world by volunteering every weekend. So as human beings, we're all stratified amongst these different, basic human needs. And sometimes we don't even register that self-esteem or self-actualization is a basic human need because we're still trying to get those, what we could call basement needs met. Now, this can be something that at each level of need, you can sustain that for quite a long time, right? Like if you've got a great marriage or a great family life, you can feel like your love and belongingness needs are met. And if nobody's threatening your ability to pay the bills, and nobody's threatening your life by holding a gun to you and robbing you or breaking into your house or whatever, then you can sustain self-esteem for quite a while. But it's still moment to moment, because if somebody draws a gun to your head, you're going to go right back down the ladder to survival really quick. So it is moment to moment. Now, when Wyatt Woodsmall said that our values are based on our needs, I'm going to take a little bit of license of guessing what he meant. I'm going to basically try to suss out what he meant when he said that. I don't think he was implying that our values change moment to moment, right? Like, I don't think he was saying that our values alter moment to moment. It's our focus alters moment to moment. These are all values we have all the time. We all value living. We all value safety. We all value having good relationships. We all value getting goals accomplished, and we all value contribution. That's just basic human values. However, our focus is going to change based on where we're at on that ladder. So I always value survival, but I might not be thinking about that all the time because my survival is not threatened. But if a person puts a gun to my head, now suddenly I'm thinking actively about the value of my survival. So it's not that the values change, it's that our focus changes based on where we're at moment to moment. Now, that's different than the Graves model. The Graves model is not moment to moment. The Graves model is based on a lifetime of development. We increase in Graves levels over time. And I really highly recommend listening to the podcast on the Graves model. It's a little too intricate to really go into right now. But for those of you that have listen to the podcast on the Graves model. The difference between Maslow's hierarchy is that Maslow's hierarchy is basic human needs and values that we can see whether or not we're getting those needs met by understanding what the needs are and understanding where our value focus is, right? If we're not getting a need met, we're probably focusing on that value at that moment. The Graves model, on the other hand, charts our progress through time. And one of the easiest ways to understand where we're at in the Graves model is to understand how much territory we're taking in. How big is or expansive is our view of life? At earlier or lower levels of the Graves model, we might only be able to see ourselves and our immediate family members. But as we get, more and more developed over time, we might start to see the people we work with as our family members, right? There are certain business environments where everybody feels like really simpatico. We're all in this together. It's not just co-workers, they're family. And then over time, we might expand that family feel to more than just coworkers. It might eventually become, if we get high enough levels, to the whole world, right? Like we might see the whole global family as part of our family. So we don't, unlike Maslow, where it is moment to moment in the sense that it's not like it changes every moment, but it can change. You can descend levels of need if you're put or thrust into a context that threatens one of those lower needs. The Graves model does not thrust people into lower levels. Once you ascend to a level, you're there, and you kind of can't go back, right? Your world is now that expansive. And it will alter your personal values. Maslow is more a reflection of human values, people values in general. Graves' model indicates values change based on your own individual perception of them. And as we take in more territory, it's not necessarily that our values change, it's that we've got more information to work with. So our values morph, they evolve to understand a greater context. So the third component that Frederick was mentioning as values is his decision-making process. And if you go onto Personality Hacker on the blog, you'll see that we talk about 4 different decision-making processes: harmony, effectiveness, authenticity, and accuracy. Harmony is the decision-making process that all FJs in the Myers-Briggs system use. Effectiveness is the decision-making process that all TJs or thinker-judgers in the Myers-Briggs system use. Authenticity is what all FPs or feeler-perceivers use, and accuracy is what all TPs or thinker-perceivers use. So this is, because it's our decision-making process, it is our evaluative criteria when we're making decisions. Anytime you make a decision, that is a moment when you are saying something should be a certain way, right? Because in order to make a decision, you have to first say, I should do this course of action. So when we make a should statement, we're basing that off our evaluation. Well, the word evaluation, within the word evaluation, is the word value. So depending upon our Myers-Briggs type, we have different evaluative criteria, or you could also see it as the stuff we focus on, the stuff we take into consideration before we make a decision. And because our evaluation is based on should statements, we oftentimes have our values as people emerge from that decision-making process.
One of the things we tried to do when we named, well, not tried to do, one of the things we did do when we named these cognitive functions, the way you're making decisions, harmony, effectiveness, accuracy, authenticity, is we tried to embed the value, or at least a general sense of the value that you're using to make decisions, embedded in the nickname for that process you're using. So for example, someone that's an FJ, a feeler judger in the Myers-Briggs system that is using harmony is an indicative value of theirs. In other words, it's a predictive value of theirs that they're using. What will be harmonious? What will get everyone's needs met? What will create harmony in the situation? Embedded in the nickname itself is a key to what they value in when they're making decisions. So that's just something to watch for. Obviously, effectiveness people are looking for the effective thing. Authenticity people are looking for what's authentic to them. Accuracy people are looking for what makes sense, what's accurate. So these are embedded in the nicknames themselves. It's just a quick guide to think about, oh, that makes so much sense. No wonder you guys named them those things, because that's what you're doing when you're making valuative judgments about things.
Right. So now we've got 3 different models. We've got Myers-Briggs and the decision-making processes that come with each type. And we've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is an understanding of human values in general and how our focus changes based on which need is going unmet. And then we have the Graves model, which is an understanding of how our values evolve over time based on how much territory we're taking in. So let's just use one example to see how this all would mesh together if you're going to overlay these models. So Frederick is an INFJ in the Myers-Briggs system. That means he's a feeler judger. He's an FJ. And that means his decision-making process, or how he evaluates information to make a decision, is based on harmony. Harmony is a question of what gets everybody's needs met. Harmony is very much about conflict resolution, managing people's needs, making sure that we're all keeping our finger on the pulse of what is socially appropriate, unspoken social contracts, making sure that we're doing things in other people's best interest, not just our own. So as an INFJ, he's going to, no matter what the context, no matter what his level of development, and no matter where he's at on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, his first line of defense, or I could say maybe the OS system, his operating system, is always going to be going through a filter of what gets everybody's needs met. Now, if you add in the Graves model, which is his levels of development, remember when I said early on it might be getting everybody's needs met might just be about getting your immediate family's needs met, right? At lower levels. And then at, slightly higher levels, it'll be what gets my family, immediate family, and my coworkers' needs met, right? Because now they've become an extension of my family, and all of those people are important too. And then at higher levels, it's going to be, how do we get humans' needs met? How do we get everybody's needs met? Because everybody's a part of my family. So before we talked about how at low levels, it's I'm focused on my family, and then I'm focused on a slightly bigger world of my family and my coworkers. And then, now I'm focused on the global community. When you put the component of harmony in there, it's going to be my family's needs met, my family, my coworkers' needs met, the global community's needs met. Right? Does that make sense? If you were going to take a different decision-making process, let's take effectiveness, which is what thinker-judgers use. They would be asking the criteria of what works, what's the most effective. Again, we could stagger it with the Graves model. At lower levels, it's what's effective for my family, what's going to work to get my, whatever my family's goals met are. Then it's going to be what gets my business or my coworkers or my bosses goals met. And then at higher levels, it's going to be what gets humanity's goals met. So you just plug in the decision-making process into a bigger and bigger context. So you're still looking through the same lens. It's just you've got a bigger context now from which to see, right? You're pulling in more territory. You're pulling in more data and information. So the goals will change because the context has changed, but the goals still remain through the lens of harmony, what gets everybody's needs met, effectiveness, what works, and so on and so forth. Now add the component of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is how my needs doing, right? So on a normal day, most people are somewhere between safety and security, like trying to get their bills paid, all the way up to self-esteem, trying to get my big goals met, right? Most of us float between the 3 levels of safety and security, love and belongingness, and self-esteem. That's where most people in average, developed countries are kind of floating between the 3. So let's take somebody who, say, harmony, what gets everybody's needs met. Let's say they are at the coworker level in the Graves model, right? I'm calling it the coworker level because that was my illustration, but that's a gross oversimplification of this particular level. And I do recommend listening to the Graves model.
What level would that map to if they are going to go back and listen to the formal
podcast? This would be about Graves 4, right? The blue level. That's what I'm seeing it as. So they are a harmony person who's approximately a Graves level 4. And so they are thinking about their family and their coworkers. And they personally are at love and belongingness needs. So their love and belongingness need is going to be met within the frame of making sure their coworkers are feeling good and liking them, right? That's approximately where they're going to be at. And making sure their family likes them and making sure that everybody's getting their needs met and everybody feels good. Maybe they bring cupcakes to work, right? Let's say they go down one level and now they're in safety and security. Maybe they're not being able to pay their bills, all right? So what ends up happening then is they're still trying to get everybody's needs met. So the thing that's distressing to them is that if I don't get my bills paid, my family might get evicted from the house. That's usually the focus for a harmony person. So my family might get evicted from the house and they won't get their needs met, and it's going to create a lot of drama and conflict. And when they go to work, that might show up in that they're not on love and belongingness. So maybe they're not bringing cupcakes to work anymore. Maybe they're a little strained at work. Maybe, relationships are not that great at work, or maybe they're trying extra hard to keep good relationships at work to ensure that they don't get fired. So it will alter. Maslow's hierarchy will indicate which needs are going met and unmet. And they're going to have a direct impact on how you respond to the world you're occupying in the Graves model. And also, it's going to alter how your decision-making process is expressed. So whenever you marry different models together, it's really good to get clarity around how something like, say, a value shows up in the different models so that you don't confuse basically, when you're triangulating, you don't confuse that, this is maybe my personal need. When it's Maslow's hierarchy, it is your personal need, but it's a reflection of human needs, versus my personal need of harmony, which is different than maybe your personal need of authenticity.
So I want to give a real world example here. It's a little bit of a speculative example, and hopefully it works for the sake of this, to bring home what you're talking about. Because as you're talking about this, I think it can get very confusing very quickly where the value is placed on what. And I think maybe one of the things I do to learn is I mismatch. I look at the opposite of something to really understand what I'm trying to unpack and learn. So I want to mismatch a little bit, look at something that maybe is a bad example, but it's also a good example because it's such a bad example. It's illustrative in this. For a long time, we've speculated, and we could be wrong about this, but we've speculated Adolf Hitler was an NFJ, an intuitive feeler judger, probably an ENFJ. We're not positive about this, but that's our speculation. If that's true, if our speculation on Adolf Hitler is correct, that means he uses the harmony process. He would have used the harmony process to make his decisions. That's his evaluative process. Well, this is a man who committed mass genocide using a process that's supposed to be getting everyone's needs met. So you back up and you go, whoa, what in the world's happening here? This man wanted to get the needs of Germany met. And so that was his value. His personal evaluative criteria was, I want to create harmony for a country and for a nation that I appreciate and I love and I want to be a part of. And then he had a value somewhere that there was a people group in that country that was causing all of the problems. And so to get everyone's needs met, he needed to eradicate an entire people group. So these almost look like contradictory terms here, or contradictory things that are going on. One, he has this process he's filtering everything through. And then the other is he's doing some pretty horrible things in the midst of that.
Right, because on the Maslow level, he would probably have been perpetually in safety and security needs going unmet, regardless of how much resource he had. So he would be perpetually believing that the people he loved, right, like the Graves level worldview incorporated Germany, but only a subset of Germany, only Germans that he personally related to. So his worldview did not expand to all people living in Germany. Those were not Germans in his mind. His worldview would only have been, basically an extension of what he thought his immediate family was. Only other Germans that he personally related to. So that was the size of his world. They didn't include, people he thought were threatening those Germans that he related to. They were threatening their safety and security. So in Maslow's hierarchy of need, he was probably perpetually feeling that his safety and security needs were going unmet. And he demonized a group of people outside of his Graves level territory and targeted them in order to attempt to get his safety and security needs met.
Correct. So you can start to see if you take just this example, again, if I'm right on my guess of Hitler's type, which is speculative, but I think it's still an interesting exercise to think through. Let's just assume I'm right. Think through the different values that are going on there that seem to be, well, and they are in conflict with each other. They don't just seem to be, they are in conflict with each other. But you can see how someone can take values and basically compartmentalize where those values lie. So this idea of triangulation and trying to get precise and like detailed to where are your values? Well, what values are we talking about? Because we are a stratification of our values. It's not a tidy one size fits all, I value X, and so I'll always behave this way. You may value X on your Graves level development. You may value Y on your Maslow frame. And then you may value something completely different for your decision-making process. And it's really that disparate in how you're coming to your values that makes the difference.
Right. And that's why it's so important to address all of them. First, understanding what is the lens I'm always going to be looking through. The lens you're always going to be looking through, the one constant, is your decision-making process. That one doesn't change. That's hardwired into your brain. The two that do change over time are your Graves level and your Maslow's needs, whether or not they're getting met. So with the one, I guess where this is helpful is going, okay, I'm always going to be looking through whatever your type's evaluation criteria is. For me, I'm accuracy. I'm a thinker perceiver, so it's always about accuracy. I'm always looking for things that make analytical sense to me. I'm always looking for models that make greater analytical sense in the world. It's always about what is accurate to me, right? Radical honesty all the way. And that's not going to change. It's not going to change moment to moment. It's not going to change over the course of my life. That is a fixed component. However, if I'm looking at my Graves level, that will tell me how big my world is, how much information I'm willing to take in to plug into what's accurate. If my world has a small framework, then what's accurate is going to look different than if I bump that framework out, because when I bump the framework out, I'm going to have more information to work with. So a thinker perceiver, an accuracy person at Graves level 4 is probably going to have a smaller, limited concept of what makes analytical sense to them than a Graves level 5 or Graves level 6. So you could see two thinker perceivers arguing it out if one's a 6 and one's a 4, because the 6 is going to go to the 4, you're not taking enough information, right? And the 4 won't see any information that they can't see. You can't see what you can't see. So they're going to be arguing for their position. So even if you've got two accuracy people, if they're at two different levels of development, what information they have access to will alter. And then which need is going unmet, knowing which need you have a tendency to believe is going unmet. That's also important. Hitler probably perpetually believed his safety and security needs were going unmet. Regardless of how much wealth or how much position and power he garnered, that was where he was stuck, right? Like he believed he had to fight for the Germans that he related to. He had to fight for their safety and security. And it's probably because it was a pretty early imprint for him. There's lots of information to indicate that he felt very unsafe in early times and he got imprinted there. So knowing, and because of that, because he was trying to protect the Germans, the interests of the Germans he related to and get their needs met, he was willing to do truly terrible things. So knowing where you're stuck on Maslow, like when you have a need going unmet, the very first thing you do is get it met. And then if you for some reason perpetually can't get it met, the question is this all in your head, right? Are you imprinted to think you have a need there? Very, very important. And then when you look at your territory at the Graves level, when you identify where you're at in the Graves level, go, maybe I have this need going unmet because I'm just not seeing a big enough expanse. Maybe I'm not seeing a big enough territory. Maybe this need is going totally met, but I just can't see it yet. And then acknowledge that you have more developmental levels to go. So that's one of the reasons why this is so helpful, because it shows where we have authentic true lacks, like true needs going met, versus perhaps imprinted needs. Maybe something isn't a need going unmet, but we think it is. And if we recognize that maybe we're just not at a level of development to acknowledge that it's met, then we just need to get there.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Frederick, for that question. And hopefully we have answered it fully. I think we actually are kind of coming up on a long period of time for two questions.
Yeah.
unfortunately, I think we probably should take a break here, take a pause, and then let's go ahead and start our weekly short form. Hopefully it's going to be short form after this episode. Answering questions. I don't care if it's that short. I think it'll be interesting as long as the content is good and as long as people resonate with it. I think, you as a listener, let us know. We'll answer questions fully, but we won't belabor them if we can.
I would make no promises about that.
I will promise that. I don't know if you will. I
have a tendency to be chatty.
That's okay. Well, we want to hear from you. We are taking a quick break from our business career focus this week. We'll be back with that next week. And we want to know what's going on in your life. We're glad you're here listening with us. We wish you could talk right now and communicate with us, and we could have a conversation with you as well as that third person. But we can't, except on the website. You can come over to personalityhacker.com, or you can go to facebook.com/personalityhacker, or twitter.com/personalityhack, and interact with us. Let us know what's going on. Leave comments, feedback, questions, whatever happens over there. And you're probably going to want to give a pitch for people subscribing and leaving feedback on the podcast, aren't you?
No, actually, what I was about to say is, and now that you know that we're addressing questions from listeners, please feel free to shoot us an email at info, @personalityhacker.com. Shoot us a question, and we'll get to it on the podcast.
If you're listening to this, there may be a time when we put a form on the website to formalize questions. So if you shoot an email to info@personalityhacker.com and you don't get a response, or you're like, why did it go to ether? What's going on? We still check that for our information and getting emails back and forth. But we're probably going to set up a formal form just to manage the amount of questions we're getting. It'll put it into a place where maybe an administrative assistant or someone can help us siphon through some of these questions. We're getting so much in. So by the time you're hearing this episode,
that's true.
We may have that already set up, and you could probably find that at personalityhacker.com if it's set up. It's not set up this moment, but I'm guessing by the time you hear this, there'll be a form for you to fill out. So go to personalityhacker.com, and that form is online there, most likely, by the time you're hearing this. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We are very excited you're with us this week. Can't wait to talk to you again next week. Talk to you then.